Hello and welcome to this Sunday school lesson session time. Our lesson, we are still talking about when the church prays, and our lesson today is your all on the altar. Now, and if you have the lesson in front of you, you will notice that the word all is in all caps because all on the altar. So let's get ready and dive into this great lesson. We welcome you, certainly, our e-campus members, Hardin County, Indiana, Louisville, Doscomana, and all those who, even if you don't belong to St. Stephen, that's okay. St. Stephen can still belong to you. And welcome for this special Bible study time. I want you to know that this lesson that we're going to be looking at today is certainly a familiar passage because we will look at Elijah on Mount Carmel. The last 2 weeks we looked at the church being in prayer, but I want us to understand that there are times when an individual can pray and stand for God in the gap. So after studying this lesson, our students will see that a great spiritual showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and they will understand that there is no God but Jehovah. And here's the good news. This is shouting territory right here. He cannot be defeated regardless of the odds. I don't care what the odds are. We are battling COVID. He's not. We need to tune into him because he cannot be defeated. Nothing, high blood, low blood, no blood, cancer, COVID, whatever it might be, unemployment, the weather, nothing can defeat the true and living God. So, what is our need? In our old school church I grew up in, we had altar call every Sunday. Yeah, I said it, every Sunday. We had altar call. But somehow or another, in today's church, we seem to have forgotten doing the altar call. And the greatest need of this hour is for men and women who will rebuild the altar. Rebuild the altar. After rebuilding the altar, to call back to God. Our children have gone astray. Our church is doing whatever they want to. Our community, so much violence in the neighborhood. And our commitment. I guess maybe if I put commitment first, then we would be ready to call back our children, our church, our community. But I have commitment at the bottom because that's the foundation. Teach Geneva. That's the foundation. Everything is held up by our commitment. And the altar is the meeting place with God. It's where you go and climb Mount Moriah and give up your Isaac to God. What is your Isaac? What is your Isaac? What is it that you need to give up? Or what is it that you need to put all on the altar? There is, in our lesson, I forgot to mention it, but there is, a chart that said, is your all on the altar? And it shows what we need to put on the altar. You see that? Look in your lesson. You got it. There it is. You need to put pride, our ministries, our sins, our goals, our programs, our business, our time. Put it on the altar. Put it on the altar. And we need to put our Isaac. See, some of that pride, self, ministry. We love ministries more than we love church. And we love church more than we love Christ. Something is wrong. Is your all on the altar of sacrifice lay? Your heart does the Spirit control. You can only be blessed and have peace and sweet rest as you yield Him your body and soul. So, the altar is a place of consecration, of sacrifice, consecration. It's on the altar that things have to die. So, let's let now. Whew, I'm telling you, this is, we are in some trying times, and the church needs to be in prayer. Now, let's look at the spiritual atmosphere at this time. The people were corrupt. Why? Ahab, who is the king, he marries Jezebel, and she's got to be one of the most wicked women I know that's in the Bible, but in the world, she's so wicked, so low down. I have never, in all my years, seen a child, a mother name her daughter Jezebel. The name even depicts treachery, wickedness, ungodliness. And here Ahab aligned himself with Jezebel. And they are a wicked couple. Why? Because Ahab forsook the true and living God. Jezebel blatantly honored and supported the priests of Baal. She supported her God. But Ahab, he forsook the true and living God. That just somehow doesn't make sense. And what happens, and they just were out of control. Out of control. And the nation then is kind of like us today. They had a habit of honoring people who deserve none. We give accolades to perverse movie stars and television heroes, and we elevate the athlete and the politician, and they live ungodly and perverted lives, and yet we are ready to kill, assassinate, beat up, talk about them. Anyone who has the backbone to speak power or speak truth to power, let me put it that way. But on this scene steps one of the greatest prophets, and that was Elijah. He was one of the greatest prophets of the Old Testament, and it was during these dark and terrible days of Ahab and Jezebel. Now, they were terrible. In fact, 1 Kings 16:33 said, he did more to provoke the anger of the Lord, not they, because God wasn't looking to Jezebel. He knew that she was a Baal worshiper. So what we see is that God was more angry. He did more to provoke the anger of the Lord God of Israel than any king before him. And Elijah was a voice in the wilderness. He was a light in the darkness. He stood in the gap for God when it was suicidal to do so. And we need more heroes like him in today. In Exodus 5:2, we find the question, Pharaoh asked the question. He said, "Who is God that I should obey him, obey his voice to let Israel go?" See, there have always been fights or contests between other gods and the true and living God. So, I wanted us to see our God can't be defeated. I said that. But sometimes I need to prove it to you. This is just some of the contests. You see Exodus 7, verses 10 through 12, the God of Israel versus the gods of the Egyptians. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did what the Lord had commanded them. Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a serpent. That didn't bother Pharaoh, because Pharaoh called in his own wise men and sorcerers. And these Egyptian magicians did the same thing with their magic. They threw down their staffs, which also became serpents. But, and that's where you get it, but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Then Numbers 33 and 4 tell you, meanwhile, the Egyptians were burying all of their firstborn sons, whom the Lord, you see, the Lord is in all caps, that's Jehovah, fighting for us, had killed the night before. The Lord had killed the night before. The Lord had defeated the gods of Egypt that night with the great acts of judgment. God cannot be defeated. Let's look at the next one. 1 Samuel 5, 1 through 7 is the God of Israel versus the God of the Philistines, Dagon. And because some of you may not be familiar with this, I'm going to read this whole thing, because you got to get this. After the Philistines captured the ark of God, they got it away from the Israelites. They took it from the battleground. Actually, the Israelites, they left it. They ran off leaving everything. So they captured the ark of God. They took it from the battleground at Ebenezer to the town of Ashdod. They carried the ark of God into the temple of Dagon and placed it beside an idol of Dagon. Woo, there's that word again. But when the citizen of Ashdod went in to see it the next morning, Dagon had fallen with his face to the ground in front of the ark of the Lord. Now, I need to tell you, Dagon wasn't nothing but a statue. But here he had fallen with his face to the ground in front of the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon up and put him in his place again. Well, wait a minute, what kind of God is that? I got to pick him up. I need a God who can pick me up. Woo! Not pick him up. But the next morning, oops, the same thing happened. Dagon had fallen face down before the ark of the Lord again. This time, his head and hands had broken off and were lying in the doorway. Only the trunk of his body was left intact. And that is why to this day neither the priests of Dagon nor anyone who enters the temple of Dagon in Ashdod will step on his thresholds. Then the Lord's heavy hand struck the people of Ashdod and the nearby village with a plague of tumors. When the people realized what was happening, they cried out and said, "We can't keep the ark of the God of Israel here any longer. He is against us." Do you see the power that we are connected to with the true and living God? We will be destroyed along with Dagon our God, they said. So, ding, ding, give me the bell. So God defeats the Philistine god. And then 1 Samuel 17, we know that story. The God of David versus the God of Goliath. And we know how that, just with a little rock, this giant was beaten by a young man, a young boy. It's felt that David must have been about 17 years old. But he stepped out there declaring, because Goliath had said, oh, you come to me, you must think I'm a dog, that you come to me, sending this little pup. But David said to the Philistine, thou comest to me with the sword, the spear, and the shield. But, there's that but word again. I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defiled. And when I get through with you, all the earth will know that there is a God in Israel. And now we almost got to ask ourselves, does the world know that there is a God in America? Then you see in your lessons there's the God of Philip versus the God of Simon. But here's the good news. How was it won? How did these things won? Look at Colossians 2:15. Colossians 2:15. In this way, he disarmed the spiritual rulers and authorities. He, who? Jesus. He shamed them publicly by his victory over them on the cross. See, all of them, their arms were too short to box with God. But now we come to a classic biblical example where a servant of God sets up a battle between the true and living God and the gods of his enemy. Now, let me say, you need to go back and read all of chapter 18. But let me tell you, just for purpose of study today, that Elijah had told Ahab, I told you he stood in the gap, said there ain't going to be any rain until I say so. So there was a drought in the land, and then God told Elijah to tell Ahab that and then leave. And Ahab looked for him, but he couldn't find him. You know why he couldn't find him? Because God had Elijah to hide in plain sight. He had Elijah to go into the land of the pagan gods. And that's where we know about the widow and she fed Elijah. Well, that was in Tyre and Sidon. In that area, that was the capital of Baalism. But now, after time has passed, droughts in the land, there has been a drought, there's been no rain for 3.5 years. God tells Elijah, to go back and confront Ahab. And our lesson picks up with 1 Kings 18, verses 17 and 18. When Ahab saw Elijah, he exclaimed, so it is really you, you troublemaker of Israel. Is it really you? And Elijah says, I have made no trouble for Israel. You and your family are the troublemakers, for you have refused to obey the commands of the Lord and have worshipped the images of Baal instead. Now, let's look at point 1, scornful. Ahab sees Elijah and he is not happy. In fact, he calls him a troublemaker. And a troublemaker is someone, of course, who causes trouble, who stirs up discord, who disturbs others, who agitates, causes mental agitation or distress. And you've got to wonder. I gave you a point to ponder. You need to ponder these points. You have to realize that when you get serious about serving God, 100% sold out, you will be viewed as a troublemaker. Another point to ponder. And I asked you the point to ponder. Why? Why will you be viewed as a troublemaker? I'm not going to answer. That's your point to ponder. The next point to ponder. Most people are satisfied to live around the altar, but you have chosen to live on the altar as a living sacrifice. God don't want no more dead sacrifices. He's had enough dead animals, and the sacrifice that his son made settled everything. So what God needs is a living sacrifice. So now, what you need to ponder, what is the difference to you between living around the altar versus living on the altar? Because look at Romans 12:1. It said, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. So God expects that. All right? Perhaps if you think about it. Think about it. You being a living sacrifice. You're living on the altar and not just around the altar. It's kind of like some of us, we are at church, but we're not in church. Woo! Some of us don't have the church in us. Okay, 1 Kings 18 and verse 19. Now, this is Elijah. He says, summon all Israel to join me at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who are supported by Jezebel. So now we see a summons. Gather your prophets for a showdown at Mount Carmel. Excuse me there. I forgot to put it, to turn it off, but I can do that now. Okay. Because if it wasn't the Lord, I don't need to hear from him no way. So, he said, I think Satan didn't want me to tell you this part, but he can forget it because it's going to be told. Why Mount Carmel? It was a stronghold. It was a large mountain. And whoever controlled Mount Carmel controls the northern half of the nation militarily and politically. Whoever controlled Carmel controlled the nation spiritually. So there was a lot up for grabs. So, in other words, Elijah said, I'm gonna take it to your backyard. This is where you think you own everything. I'm gonna show you how bad God is. Because see, years earlier, the idol worshippers tore down the altar to God and erected a great altar to Baal. And Baal was a degrading religion. It was a mixture of idolatry, perverted sexuality, and child sacrifice. So they worship the idols, Baal and Asherah. And Asherah was supposed to, I guess, be, she was the female part of Baal. And these gods supposedly controlled agriculture, the weather, and the fertility. And so therefore, when it come to the agriculture part, they didn't mind cutting themselves on the altar to make the crops grow. So they gave a blood sacrifice. Fertility, you know, virgins would have sex with priests before marrying to increase their fertility. How crazy is that? And who would want to give up their child as a sacrifice so that I can get my prayers answered? But God's going to show them. I don't need you to throw no child in no fire for me. I will bring the fire. So let's go on back. Chapter 18, 1 Kings chapter 18, 20 through 21. So Ahab summoned all the people of Israel and the prophets to Mount Carmel. Then Elijah stood in front of them and said, "How much longer will you waver, hobbling between two opinions?" The King James Version said, "How long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him." But the people were completely silent. Now let's look at point 3, silence. For generations, Israel has been trying to worship Jehovah and Baal at the same time. And God has already told us that you cannot. He's a jealous God. And this is one of the first commandments. Thou shalt have no other God before me. You shall not bow down and worship him. And yet, here they are. They worship Jehovah. They worship Jehovah and Baal at the same time. Matthew 6:24, A part tells us, no one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the others. See, they want it both ways. They want to live their life worshiping God, but then they want to live their life doing what the Baal folks did. Now, here's the point to ponder. If it is physically impossible to set straddling a fence in the physical world, why do we think that it is impossible, that it is possible in the spiritual world? Now, you try to set straddling a fence in the physical world and it hurts. You can't do it very long. Some fences you don't even try it. But yet we think in the spiritual world that we can live straddling the fence. Then a point to ponder, how are we straddling the spiritual fence today? How are we? Think about that. But now, I got to take some time. When he had summoned them, Elijah said, "How much longer will you waver, hobbling between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." That's where we jump and we go down to the face-off. And we miss a very important sentence in this. It says, but, there we go with the but again. But the people were completely silent. And we need to look at point 3, silence. Because, as I said, they had been trying to worship Baal and worship God. But when it's brought to their attention, they were silent. And Ecclesiastes tells us there's a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heaven. A time to be silent and a time to speak. And yet, the church has gone quiet. Even in today, we have gone quiet. Church folks have become so immoral that you cannot tell the difference between church people and lost people. The church is walking with the world. Instead of, we have allowed the world to come into the church instead of the church going into the world. Because my sisters and brothers, please hear me. You cannot run with the devil all week and stand with Jesus on Sunday. It will not work. He don't want no one day out of 7. He wants all 7 days. You cannot go to bed with Satan and wake up with Jesus. It just doesn't work that way. It is time. And America and the church in America has been quiet. In fact, the church, now hear me now, and you don't have to agree with me, but I'm not going to take it back. I think the church is the reason things are as bad as they are in America. I'll say it again. I think the church is the reason why things are as bad as they are in America. Because we refuse to speak up and speak out. We see Black Lives Matter. But yet, what happened? We see the police shooting down unarmed, particularly people of color in the streets. And we being quiet. We decide. The church, I'm just going to say evangelical church, were the ones who were behind putting Trump in the White House. And nobody said anything when democracy was attacked a year ago. The church was quiet. And yet, we need to remember it was the church who was in the forefront, was the reason that blacks got civil rights in the first place. It was Martin Luther King out front, along with his sidekick. I forgot to name all that. But it is time for America to choose. It's time for the church to choose. Moses said it this way, who's on the Lord's side? And that's the question to us today. Time for America to choose. Are you on the Lord's side? Are you on the side for power? For the Trumps? For the McConnells? Are you on the side for taking voting rights from people because you want your people to keep you in power? It's time for the church to choose. And it's time for you to choose. Joshua put it this way, but if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourself this day, not tomorrow, this day, whom you will serve. Will the gods of your ancestors serve beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living? But That's one of the greatest buts in the Bible. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And God warns us against indecision. Matthew 12:30 said, anyone who isn't with me opposes me. And anyone who isn't working with me is actually working against me. Teach, Geneva. Now let's come to 1 Kings 18 through 22 through 29. Oops. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only prophet of the Lord who is left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Now bring two bulls. The prophets of Baal may choose which one they wish and cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood of their altar, but without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood of the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God. Now the people speak, and all the people agree. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, hey dudes, y'all go first. For there are so many of you. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it and call on the name of your God. But don't set fire to the wood. So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called on the name of the Lord from the morning until noontime. I cannot imagine doing all that shouting. And they were shouting, oh, Baal, answer us. But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced, hobbling around the altar they made. About noontime, Elijah began to have a little fun with them. He mocked them. You need to shout a little louder, he scoffed. For surely he is a god. Or perhaps he is daydreaming. Or maybe he had to go to the bathroom. He's relieving himself. Or maybe he's away on a trip. Or is asleep. Or he took a vacation. Maybe you need to wake him up. So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves. See, their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. See, this is Mount Carmel. Fast forward ahead to Mount Calvary. And guess what? Blood was shed on Mount Calvary, but the blood of Jesus. Not us having to cut ourselves, but he shed his blood. Woo, come on back. Verse 29, they raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice. But still there was no sound, no reply, no response. Okay, round one is Baal's time. And the priests of Baal, they accepted the challenge. They called on their false god Baal to light the fire. They danced around the altar from morning till noon. But there was no answer. And then Elijah, they mocked. They kept on dancing. At midday, they kept their frantic dancing and jumping up and down, ranting and raving until the evening sacrifice. Now, let me say this at the evening sacrifice. I have a thought here for you. And this is a clear picture of the futility of idolatry and false worship. The prophets of the false god Baal prayed and did all they could to arouse him to action. They did all they could. They even went so far as to mutilate their bodies, shed their own blood in an attempt to satisfy the false god Baal, hoping that the sacrifice of their own blood will make them acceptable to Baal. And they did this all day long. But guess what? They got no response. Why not? Because false gods are just this, false. They are non-existent, not really living, not possessing life. They are powerless, unable to respond, lifeless. They cannot hear prayers, not reach out to help us in our desperate hour needs. In fact, go back to Dagon, they had to pick Dagon up off the floor. False gods are totally incapable of being present with us as we walk day by day. They are unable to guide us or to fulfill any promises made by their false prophet. Habakkuk 2:18 asked the question, what good is an idol carved by man or a cast image that deceives you? How foolish to trust in your own creation, a God that cannot even talk. But now we come to the next round. And Elijah called the people. He said, come over here. Y'all come here. I want y'all crowd around and see this. Then they repaired the altar that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one to represent each one of the tribes of Israel. He used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of the Lord. They dug a trench around the altar large enough to hold about 3 gallons of water. He piled the wood on the altar, cut the bull into pieces, laid the pieces on the wood. He said, now fill the 4 large jars with water, pour the water over the offering and the wood. They did it. Then when they got through, he said, do it again. And so they did it again. And then the 3rd time he said, do it one more time. And the water ran around the altar, even filled up the trenches. And at that time, Elijah walked up to the altar and prayed. He said, oh Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. Oh Lord, answer me. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and you have brought them back to yourself. Immediately, the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, the dust. The dust, it even licked up all the water in the trenches. And when all the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground and cried out, the Lord, He is God. Yes, the Lord, He is God. Now, let me say this. There are 3 things. Well, let me say, and this is what we need in America right now. We need to build not highways, not expressways. We don't need to build anything in New York or Washington, but we need to build it in every city and every church and every home. And that is we need to rebuild the altar. And Elijah does the first altar call. He summons all the people to come to the altar. And then he prayed 3 things he prayed for. For the Lord to prove that He alone is God. For the Lord to prove that Elijah was God's true servant. And for the Lord to hear and answer his prayer so the people would know that the God Elijah was serving was the living God, and they would be stirred to repent. And God immediately answered. So my question to you today is your all on the altar? of sacrifice laid. Your heart does the Spirit control. You can only be blessed and have peace and sweet rest as you yield Him your body and soul. Let us declare today we will be living sacrifices, living on the altar and not around the altar. And that's our lesson, is you're all on the altar. We'll see you next week when we will continue the series, When the Church Prays. Be blessed.